So, colleagues, what I'm going to do is open up with a few questions targeted to my colleagues, and they're going to respond, and we're going to go through it, and at a particular time we're going to stop and take some questions from you. My first question is to you, Christine, please. I wanted to focus, as we mentioned, on innovation being at the forefront again, but particularly what we'd like to hear is how you in industry would define innovation.
So often, I think, when people talk about innovation, I think they think it's a new product or some technology advancement. But for me, innovation, it can be actually very broad-ranging. It's just about doing things differently or new inside your organisation. And I personally think the people at the bottom are the real coalface of the organisation, often have the best ideas. And so by talking to your employees or talking to your customers, you have a much better chance as industry to really understand what innovation can do.
Great, thanks for that. Colleagues, if anyone wants to add a little bit to those questions as they go up, please jump in. I forgot to mention that. Gillian, I might come to you now. What do you think about policy settings? We heard the Minister this morning. What policy settings do you think we need to follow to encourage business investment? And should we just be leaving it all to the market, or should there be some partnership approaches about enhancing innovation?
Well, I think we all recognise that being innovative and globally competitive is essential for businesses. It's essential for universities, even regulators, and even government if we're going to be successful. And I think with the policy settings, it's very much a necessary but not sufficient condition. And the world is very complex and changing. And I think we have to see the policy settings as being a facilitator. As was mentioned this morning, we can't wait for government to do everything. But I really think where we can improve is the interface between the private and the public sector, because the private sector, there's a bit of a tendency for there to be a policy setting and then there's sit back and wait for it to be effective. And I think the private sector who is implementing and taking advantage of these initiatives that the government sets up is in a very good position to see the shortcomings in them. And there needs to be a preparedness to listen and interface with the private sector and government to get it right. I mean, there's often a tendency for the department to think the private sector's always on a lobbying, what's in it for me approach, and very often that is the case. But, working together, you can improve the policy and keep it alive and keep Australia competitive. And a couple of areas where I think Greg Hunt mentioned this morning, there's much more appetite for doing that, both with the universities in building bridges to industry. And just to give the University of Wollongong another plug this morning, but we've had a relationship with BlueScope for, it must be more than 40 years. I'm looking up at our VC there, who'll know. But that has been very much working on the sort of thing Christine's talking about, the organic innovation, where at the fringe they're looking at new technologies, working with the university, because they're both Wollongong based and facing that. It's really given us a competitive edge in some refined steel and technologies there. And I think it's those bridges and that interface that is very important. And another area where I've seen it in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, where the purpose of that fund is to catalyse the flow of funds into emissions reduction. And just by being there, being a sort of having an appetite to share knowledge, invite people in, they come in, talk about where they're at. I mean, sometimes they're probably being unnecessarily complimentary, but they say, you're the best government entity we've ever dealt with. Maybe because we've got $10 billion, but I think it's more than that, because if you take Sundrop Tomatoes, it opened last week in out of South Australia there, and it's a sort of self-contained greenhouse, takes salt water, desalinates it, waters and generates energy in these greenhouses. And it's an overseas technology, but it's been put into Australia, and they came to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation probably 2.5 years ago, and then, you know, we said, you've got to get this equity, you've got to get that, you've got to do this, you've got to do something else. And about 18 months later, they came back and said, we don't need you, you know. We said, we'll lend to you if you get all those things. And then they came back and said, oh, we don't need you, we've got money from one of the big four at 0.25% less. And we said, great, go for it, you know. But what did you do? You facilitated and you shared the knowledge, and we found sort of you should go to these people for equity, you should go there, and you know, we did that pretty economically from their point of view. But it's that interface of taking private sector skills and being in a market and interfacing with government policy to get an outcome where you work together. And I guess that's where I see policy settings need to be flexible and changing and receptive to input that they get from the universities and the marketplace.
Great. I just might mention, I didn't mention in the introduction, you are the chair of the Clean Energy Corporation, and the example you just gave is a great one. And listening to the Minister this morning talk about the Tasmanian second interconnector.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I know that because I just did the review, and all the money in your shop is going to go to that interconnector.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be tapping on the door for it.
And I think I just heard you say something nice and polite about the commercial banks in Australia. Saying something like that in this place, I just want to congratulate you. Andrew?
They're good copiers and followers.
Good copiers and followers. Yeah, we're still in business too. Can I just say...
That's still innovation.
And yeah.
And we love everybody. Can I... Andrew, what is what steps can we take to make sure that business thinks long-term and not just short-term?
How long do I have?
I'll stop you when you've had enough, yeah.
Oh, look, I think the starting point is I have grave concerns when I look around Australian business that mostly, there's some terrific exceptions, but mostly companies think too short term. Mostly companies solve incremental problems, not large problems. And when I compare to what I see in the US in particular, in an increasingly global marketplace, where companies are solving very, very large problems with a very long time frame, we're going to lose more than we win. Given that disruption has just started to begin rather than at the end of that journey. So I'm genuinely concerned that Australia is not moving nearly fast enough down this path. I'll come to the why before, I'll try to be relatively quick, but I'll come to the why I think it's a problem. And then talk about a little bit about solutions, and I wish there were easy solutions, but the reason there's not easy solutions, there's a whole range of problems. I think some of it is cultural, some of it is the companies themselves, some of it is the investor base in Australia. They all contribute to short-term thinking, even things like CEO tenure, which was about 5 years, is coming down. Why would you even think about doing something that's got a 5 to 10 year payoff, like going to China or like some of the technology investment? When you're only going to be in the job for 4 more years, you're going to cop the pain for the investment and get none of the benefit and reward. There's that aspect. There's the shareholders, who are incredibly short-term focused in Australia. There's some really good exceptions. We've managed to find them over time in our register. People like the Hyperions of the world, people like the Fatalities. So many of them want to talk about the short-term numbers and nothing else. That's all that matters. The conversation is very, very different with investors in Australia compared to the investors I speak to in Asia or overseas. Just dramatically different conversations. I don't really understand why super funds, people put their money in for 20 plus years, but the super fund wants to evaluate the funds in which it puts its money on a quarterly basis or a half basis. That's another issue. There's a culture of failure in Australia being a bad thing. Now, you can't innovate, you can't take risks without failing occasionally. But if you're going to get murdered by the media, if you're going to get fired from your job as CEO, if you're going to get heavily criticised for doing so, rather than realising that's part of risk-taking, why do it? So there's a range of factors that I think contribute to the fact that I think undoubtedly on a whole range of measures, Australian companies do think shorter term than some people overseas. Look, I think the solution needs to come from everything. I think companies need to take some responsibility. Boards are very risk-averse nowadays. You notice a board when something goes wrong. You don't notice a board when everything just muddles along. So boards won't take big, bold risks because that's putting their head up and possibly being chopped off if things go wrong. Boards need to take that risk if they're going to do their job properly. I think the biggest risk nowadays in a disruptive age, as I said, is doing nothing or not doing enough. So boards and companies need to just put their neck out a bit and take the risk, recognise that they'll occasionally come unstuck, occasionally things will go wrong, But they do their thinking, they're willing to stick it through, but they're willing to cop the public criticism that always comes with missing short-term numbers, and explain this is part of a long-term plan, take the time to articulate it to the marketplace. All those things are possible. I think to some extent, I'm lucky. I've been doing it for 18 years rather than for 4 years. I really genuinely don't really care about my tenure. It's about SEEK being great in 10 years' time, whether I'm there or not, is what I think about. I've been through enough market cycles to know that you're popular one half, you're unpopular another half. It really doesn't matter. Much harder for a new CEO that needs to prove himself or herself by delivering on what the market expects in the next half. So I think somebody's just really having a board and management team that recognise the long term, the only way to run a business properly, and sticking to their guns as best as possible, and hopefully getting support from the media rather than criticism when they're willing to do that. Hopefully shareholders recognising that they're going to lose rather than gain in terms of long-term returns if they're focused on short-term returns. Hopefully government being supportive rather than unsupportive.
Warwick,
Christine.
as somebody who hasn't been there for 18 years, but almost 8, and I'm just a hired help, so I don't own a large part of the company. A couple of observations. One is the remuneration report voting. It's actually being used against remuneration report, and it's now being seen by a lot of board members as sort of a protest vote, and that's helping this risk averseness. So I really do feel that needs addressing, because it isn't actually protecting remuneration. It's acting for many other things. And the only learning that, well, not the only, but one of the learnings that I've experienced is when change happens, or you're trying to push for something like going into China, and regulation evolves, and it can be seen as risky. I think what you have to do is try and educate the shareholders and the market. I don't mean that patronising, but set different milestones other than financial, and try and bring them into the journey. Because at the end of the day, in the face of not having anything, I mean, we do quarterly reporting. There's nothing more short-term than that. That we're forcing them almost to measure us just by financial results. But that does require the boards to back you. And I think the benefit Blackmores has is Marcus' name's on the door. This is the legacy he's leaving behind. And I think, Andrew, you have that receipt. You and your brother founded it. And I think that does enable companies to be long-term.
Just to depart a little bit, do you think the concept of quarterly reporting and the involvement, particularly on analysts on quarterly reporting, is a real negative, or is something that companies just have to accept?
Look, my personal view is continuous disclosure has benefits in one hand. We're never worried about when we're speaking, even at an event like this and we're in closed period, because in a couple of weeks' time, we're constantly telling the market how we're going. 70% of our shareholder base are retail shareholders, they're mums and dads, and a large proportion of those have held our stock for more than 25 years. So actually, they're pretty long-term thinking. But it's as Andrew says, as now we've gone into the ASX 100, we have quant funds holding us who never want to meet us, uninterested in strategy. It's just some statistical analysis, what's happening, whether they buy or sell your share. So that goes completely against the spirit of investing for the long term. And I think that's where you get the issue. So I know personally that every time we do quarterly reporting, I say, I wish we didn't do this. But if I was a shareholder, I would want to know what's happening and feel informed. And I think when you keep people informed, you actually win their confidence through bad times as well as good.
I think that's right, and I think that just because the quarterly reporting is a bit irritating, it doesn't mean you take that data set away, but you supplement it, as Christine said, with we're in this new business. It isn't going to be cash flow positive for 5 years. We're on this path. But speaking as a director of Woolworths who made a large investment in Masters, I wasn't there at the time, but I was there riding through that. It probably has made everyone a little bit more risk averse, but I not entirely. What it has made the current board more conscious of is the need for indicators of how the hell the business was going, rather than saying, well, we're here for the long term and we're not going to be cash flow positive for 5 years, but don't anybody look at any real data that tells you you're on the wrong track. That's where it's a matter of really making sure that you invest for the longer term with a rationale that's supported by data points that you, again, correct and say, well, we're going to tweak this, or, you know, it's all, I think it's very doable, but I think it's actually separate and supplementary to the quarterly data.
Okay, let's go to technology, and let's go to the role of technology in going into opportunities abroad. We've just been through a period where we've seen lots of trade agreements, and we heard this morning a new focus on further trade agreements, mainly focused in Europe. And one of the issues for all of us is the dramatic way in which technology has enabled us to get into international markets. Small companies now can go to a whole range of different markets. So the world has dramatically changed, and as a trading nation, possessed of very, very strong intellectual capital, which is a sustainable asset for us, how businesses engage in it and use it and grow it becomes extremely important for large, medium and small businesses. So I wonder whether or not I could start, given that you're the chairman of ASEAN, Christine, to just make some broader general remarks about that and then have a thought from each of our colleagues.
Warwick, I'm extremely passionate about trying to encourage Australian companies to embrace and grow, not just in ASEAN, but in Asia. You know, 35% of global growth is coming from China at the moment. Indonesia will be the third biggest economy in the world by the year 2030. And yet, as a country, we're investing more money in New Zealand in 2015 than we're investing in Asia. And yet, why would you do that? Why would you do that when together the Australian and New Zealand economy only adds up to about 2% of the world's economy, and 98% is just up the road? And when we have industries like health, food, education, financial services, apart from resources, where we are known to be the best in the world, the highest quality, the highest standards, the growing middle class just up the road are really in need of them. Why wouldn't we go there? And of course, if we do go there, we have a much better chance of getting return on our investments and our innovation. You see, it takes, for 10 great ideas, only 1 or 2 are going to get up. So you don't just need a return from that 1 or 2 idea. You have to consider covering the costs of the ones that don't work. So you need super returns. And to get super returns, can I suggest, as much as I love this country, why would we not just go up the road? And you know, we are so lucky. Now is the time to do it, because the advances in technology enable smaller companies in Australia to really go and take it. Social media, can I give them one example? We ran a campaign on social media, just a really small campaign on WeChat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with WeChat or even have your own WeChat account, but it's almost like how the Chinese communicate. They don't use Facebook, they use WeChat. And we used Lina, the tennis player. We were doing a charity event trying to raise awareness of congenital heart disease in China in children. And we asked Lina to do it. We just recorded her in our own office on the back of someone's own camera. No big expense, okay? We asked people to log on, hook their mobile phones onto our WeChat account and track their steps. And for so many steps, we'd give money to the charity. Within days, we'd have 5 million hashtags, 800,000 people had logged on, and 25 million steps. We just could not believe it. We had to close it down. We were giving too much money away to charity. But you see, for me, that is an example of how small Australian companies can, you know, really exploit this wonderful opportunity and get their message out. They no longer have to spend millions to do it. So I think, and my final word, if you do not go and grab hold of ASEAN, beware, because the Germans are, you know, I hate saying that, because, and I love Germany too, by the way, but 23% of capital investment going into Indonesia is coming from Europe, predominantly from the Germans. So if the Europeans, when Asia look at brands, they think Canada, Germany, Australia in the same category. The Europeans can see the opportunity. Trust me, there's something there. So go grab it before they do. It's our birthright.
I certainly agree with that. Gillian?
Well, I think just moving on to education and Asia, I think the initiatives of the current government in this new Colombo plan is a sort of facilitation, which is a fairly low budget item for them, but just encouraging Australian students to undertake part of their studies in the Asian region, because there was very much a Euro focus. You know, you learnt French and German at school if you're old enough, and it was sort of this awareness and familiarity and understanding even of the history of Asia does help that connectivity. And I think education's been, as you mentioned, Warwick, the third largest export, as I say, depending on the price of gold, but we're the third largest export. It's still got most of its offshore students from Asia, whether it's India, China, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. You know, that both bringing the students here and having the education and having our students go out and be educated, I think that will help this long-term path of taking advantage of the opportunities that Christine's talking about, because they are there, but there's all a bit of, this hesitancy that comes more from the older generation than it is from the younger generation. So I'd like to be hopeful about the future that we will take advantage of that. And the data and the government can't do that for businesses, but it can facilitate entryways and data points and sharing stories of success.
The government can do one thing to help. Well, they can do lots of things, but they can do one thing particularly. If you ask a lot of small Australian businesses, why aren't you embracing Asia or ASEAN or Asia totally? They'll often say, because we don't really know, or we don't understand, we don't have the skills. The language, puts off a lot of people. We have hundreds of thousands of students right now living in Australia. What I would love to see is the government to change the rules on the number of hours these Asian students can work in our society, because legitimately they're only allowed to work 10 hours a week. And so what happens is they can't get meaningful work in small businesses, so they end up as waiters and waitresses. And whether we like this or not, so often not being paid the correct wage, working more than their 10 hours, and being employed illegally. And there is this and I know this because I took one myself with the help of Sydney University, a young law student from Korea. He helped me launch in Korea. He's now our junior lawyer. He's actually our only lawyer. And so there's just this wonderful resource. And we've just got to people say to me, oh, but we've got rules, they can stay afterwards for a year. That's actually not good enough, because these students need to go back to their families. They haven't got the money for that luxury. And if they're being sponsored in any way, those businesses want them back. But while they're here, let's have meaningful work. It's good for them, it's good for their countries, but selfishly, it's good for our business.
Great.
Sorry, I
Yeah,
shut
look,
up now.
I agree with a lot of what's been said. And, around perhaps we're in a different industry, though, in terms of technology. So in terms of the opportunity, we agree they're just enormous markets, and we're already in a position where our China business has got more revenue than our Australia business. And before too long, each of China, each of Southeast Asia, each of South America should be a lot larger than Australia, just because of the pure market size. So the opportunity is there. But I think, particularly in a more technology-related business, it's actually not about opportunity, it's about you have to do it. You've got no choice. If you think about a world where country barriers break down, increasingly global marketplaces, our starting point is simple. We have to be the best in the world at what we do, or if we're not the best in the world, there's someone better than us, and they're going to beat us everywhere, including in Australia. So a non-negotiable is we need to be the best in the world at what we do. And if we are going to be the best in the world, we need the scale to invest. So part of going overseas gives us that scale, and it's enabled us over the last 5 years in Australia to multiply by 5 our product and technology spend, which is a needed part of competing. And then again, if you're going to be the best in the world, you may as well test yourself. You may as well improve your skills by moving offshore as well as Australia. So I think for us, it's not just an opportunity, but an imperative. And I think that's probably true of a lot of other businesses, whether they've recognised that themselves or not. And then there's a lot of pieces about Asia itself, and Asia's really exciting. I think Australia actually has an advantage in Asia around proximity, around time zone, and around the fact that we tend to go into Asia much more humbly than the US and the European competitors that go in, assume that Asia is one market, where it's not. It's a range of different markets. Assume that somehow the Americans or the Europeans are much smarter than the Asians. We kind of know we're not. We know they're smarter than us. We've got some things that we can bring to bear. And much more adaptable. And we've got a lot of people that have got experience in the market. So we've got a narrow window before the Americans and the Europeans, particularly in the technology space, get better at competing in Asia, where we can really go in there and secure footholds. We're just not doing it with enough aggression.
Yeah, great. I got one more question. I think I know what you're all going to say, but I'd like to ask it just to get it on the record. I think it's important, and I think you'd all agree that where Australian businesses engage in investing in intellectual-based capital, there is real advantages. But do you think that we don't do nearly enough at all levels of business investing in intellectual-based capital?
I think we probably already, if you don't mind me saying, answered the question, because I think we're all saying there's an opportunity to invest more generally in innovation. And just like intellectual-based capital is like investing in other things, doesn't always pay off. And so at the moment, businesses, I agree with what Andrew said earlier, are risk averse. But there is significant opportunity. And I know you started by saying that book, The Startup Nation. But I went to Israel last year, and I just killed myself. I hadn't been earlier in my life. What a fabulous country. No natural resources, no nothing, except intellectual-based capital. And it was a really great reminder what brilliant things can happen if that's what you invest in.
Great.
Look, I think, as Nick Gruen made the point this morning about, I've forgotten what the figure was, this investment in human capital. It was 16 trillion. 17 trillion. I was going to say 16, so thanks, Nick. We have to value that, and we have to recognise the role of universities in building that and nurturing that. And a lot of the university human capital that's been built up isn't being leveraged as much as it could. And this, the initiatives that are being pursued at both the state and federal level to try and build the bridges to industry, get industry to use the smarts at university and the research to try and get that intellectual capital a bit more, I think leveraged is the word, but there's a small, well, I call it small, in this 10 billion fund, 10 million seems pretty small, but the New South Wales government's put 10 million into 10 universities to facilitate the matching of funds with small and medium-sized enterprises, so that if the SME invests a certain amount, the state government will match it. And it's this sending out feelers into the region where the universities are and building this bridge to try and build up the intellectual capital, because building intellectual capital within the universities where it is very strong isn't really leveraged unless you tap it out, and you get, whenever there is a problem, and a problem that might be, it might be this organic innovation that Christine's talking about, but if you can do it so much better and more professionally if you get the experts in, and you get that blend, as I mentioned before, about the private and the public sector coming together to really fuel our natural intellectual capital to something that has a better price tag on it, I think.
Yeah. Andrew, would you like to add anything?
No, it's okay.
Fine, okay. All right, well, we're all agreed on that one. Well, colleagues, let's open it to any questions. There's some roving mics here. If someone would like to throw a question to any of our panel, or a general question. And I'm just looking to see if there's any questions coming in from live stream. There must be someone, otherwise we might ask you a question. Yeah. David?
Andrew Stevens from the CEDA board, but also the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre. We have done a lot of research work into what makes Australian manufacturing businesses competitive, and we haven't found one business that is globally competitive that doesn't do more than half of their business in exports. And we've found many, many businesses that are the world leader, like 90% market share in their particular category. And one of the things that we've identified is a number of blind spots, and one of those in general population is when the government sets the settings right, we'll be competitive. In other words, let's wait until government does something to help us here. And yet, Christine, your comments, and yours, Andrew, have been quite the opposite of that, because you've said we've taken responsibility, long and short term, to do that. My question is, do you think, and it's loaded, do you think that companies are doing enough in innovation to lead?
Well, you can never do enough. But I don't think they're leveraging enough the as I mentioned, the smarts of the university where they could innovate a bit more with the skills and the specialised knowledge that there is in the university and the problems that they see that are there. So it's probably not innovating enough within their own organisations or innovating enough in terms of whole new horizons. But I think I agree with the inclination to say, well, I'm waiting for the government to do something for me. I mean, the government can't do the heavy lifting, and if we wait for government, but we do have to work with government because they can facilitate, and little investments by government, as I mentioned with the New South Wales, can really help in build these bridges and the new Colombo plan. There are initiatives. Not everything the government does is a waste of time. I mean, they really do have initiatives, and they can be responsive to trial things and pilot things to see if you want to put a bit more money into it, like you do in a commercial situation.
Look, I clearly don't think they're doing enough. But it's not because probably the CEOs or the boards don't want to. It's because a set of circumstances, and for all the things that Andrew said earlier, I'm going to say something terrible, but sometimes boards are a bit like governments. They want to stay in power, and they're worried about the remuneration report vote coming along, and are they going to, so it does create that whole risk-averse. And as Andrew said, you put money into China, it doesn't come back overnight. We've been actually there for 5 years. So it does require long-term payback. And the very fact that we're investing more money in New Zealand than in Asia is a real demonstration of that. But saying all that, I think the free trade agreements with the government, they're a really positive sign and a really good first step, and I'm really encouraged that Steve Chobo is going to take on the great work of Andrew Robb and carry on with them. In themselves, it's not really the tariffs what's the issue. They are a big pediment, but they're not the issue. For us, for example, in food and health, it's actually the ingredient strategies and the regulation as you go into a country. So for China, I really want to see a recognition of our standards here in Australia, which are the highest in the world. And if we had those, then we would be able to take more products in. China is booming because of the free trade zones. But really, to serve a market, you need to be in the broader retail market. And that requires us in this next level. The free trade agreement is just the first step. We now need a trade agreement.
The only point I make, the word I keep using in criticism is incremental. And everywhere I look, people are incrementalising. So everyone knows they need to talk about innovation and they're doing stuff. And then when I ask them what they're doing, it's a tiny team or it's a tiny amount of capital or something similar. And I think the reality of the world, and maybe I'm over-dramatising it, but the reality is in so many industries, you've got really big amounts of capital and really smart teams trying to completely transform industries and kind of wipe out your business in many cases. And if all you're doing is adding 3% investment over here or 5% over there, it's just not going to make the difference. So you need to figure out where the right places to invest are and what the right things to do are. But it tends to need to be big, bold steps rather than small incremental steps. They're going to make a difference.
Mm. Okay, thanks for that.
Energy Consumers Australia. Look, I was just picking up on a comment Gillian made up front, which was that she said we needed innovation not just for business, but also innovation by policymakers and regulators. And it appears to me that our policymakers are much the same as our businesses. They don't do a whole lot of innovation. They mostly mimic others and don't really come up with any new ideas when it comes to things like innovation. And my example of that would be, when it comes to superannuation, we just apply the competitive model. So we've got competitive super funds who are then all driven by short-term returns that then creates the problem that Andrew is complaining about. So if we've got an innovative nation, what policies do we need to get? How do we get the policymakers themselves to be innovative rather than mimicking?
Probably longer terms of election between elections.
That would work. They just do nothing for longer.
Well,
I wish I was on the panel. I'd get into you.
As soon as they get voted in. We just have a culture of knocking them off, though, as soon as they get voted in. Maybe we need to support our politicians, and it's us as voters. Don't wait for the government. We should be. Someone gets voted in, I think we should respect the people's choice and then get behind them and help them be successful. We need a long-term government.
Yeah, which is tough. It's, by the way, it's tough for governments. I have a lot of empathy or sympathy for politicians right now and the environment they're in. It's very hard to make long-term decisions because you won't last long enough to see it through.
Just coming on to energy, though, I think the recent experiences in South Australia will end up being a good thing for Australia, because at least they've got now COAG and focusing on, look, it isn't all about reliability. Reliability is important, but it's about getting some kind of agreement between states and federal and even bipartisan things where we can get together and say there's got to be because if there's anything long-term, it's energy. And if we don't get that right and don't get the priorities and the directives of the main regulatory bodies and overseeing bodies right, which we've left fixed for 20 years practically, then it just hasn't changed at all. There's been a lot of bickering at the fringe, but really I think we can, if we can get a bit more of what I see cooperation between private and public and between the parties, we can all progress a little bit further.
Okay. One question up there.
Diane Gander, I'm one of those risk-averse board members that
I'm feeling like one of those
about.
myself.
Yeah, it's a bit that way at the moment, isn't it? But I'm very taken by the really strong arguments about looking outside Australia's shores. And one of the things that interests me is we're in very low interest rate environments. Money is pretty much free, so it would seem to be a fantastic time to be taking some bets offshore. But as a director, what you sometimes see is management come in with investment proposals and there is the same old hurdle rate that we've been seeing for ages. And I think one of the things that's directed at boards is, well, you are not changing the hurdle rate, but I'm not sure management's too excited about that. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that topic or maybe some examples from your own organisations where the hurdle rate has been changed to reflect better opportunity offshore, because what I hear is, oh, it's a bit risky off there, so we'll keep the hurdle rate where it was before.
Oh, these things take a long time to change. I was reminded of when I was on the board of Woodside, and when the oil price was $100, the break-even price you had to do for the long-term investment was still 40, it took a long time to get it up from 20 to 40. So I think there's a hesitancy to change that, but I think as opportunities narrow and there's a re-examination of there's certainly a lot more discussion around the boards I'm on about, look, what's the rate of return we should be thinking about, what's the weighted average cost of capital, what sort of risk can we take here. So I think it's now that there's a sort of acceptance that inflation is not about to return despite the amount of money in the system. There's a bit of a sense of, look, what do you do to try and grow and get a growth in earnings when you have deflation? Those sorts of debates are at least being considered.
I think you can help Warwick actually, because if you go to the bank and say, I'd like to build a facility down in Adelaide, can you lend me $10 million? They'll say, sure, and they just give you whatever your margin rate is over cash. I'd like to spend $10 million building a business in China. They'll say, sure, that's 3 times your normal rate. So to start off with, the banks generally make it more expensive to us, so they put that hurdle in because they say it's higher risk. Potentially it is higher risk, but I would suggest it's the opposite if you don't do it. But there are many ways to measure, and they're not just financial. So I'll just give you a slight example. When I went to Marcus and said, look, Marcus, I want us to spend all this money in Asia and try and turn it around, and generally we weren't making any profits there. We'd been already there for 35 years, and I'm not sure when you're going to see your cash back. That was actually my business case. Don't know when you're going to see your cash back, don't know when you're going to get a return. I just know we need to do it. Why? Because we needed to build a natural hedge in the business because our raw materials came from overseas. We needed to have diversification of risk. And so I talk through the other strategic reasons, because generally Marcus would always say a business plan is out of date the day the board has signed it off. So, which is true, isn't it? It's like budgets. Anybody who is in a company, your budgets change the very next day. You've got a different view. So I think we need to think differently about hurdle rates. They're not just financial. There are many different ways to think about them. And they're probably more strategic, but you probably have a different view.
Oh, no, I just agree with you completely. I mean, we're unusual. I think part of the reason we've done okay is financials come last for us. They really come
Yeah.
last. We focus on operational outcomes. We spent 5 years losing a lot of money because it's all about the marketplace, all about getting jobs, it's all about getting hirers. The reason we're happy to stick the course in China, even though we lost money for 5 years there, and I got to say, our share price would have jumped dramatically if we'd closed up shop in China for most of those 5 years. Shareholders were begging us to close. So we saw the operational metrics moving in the right direction. We saw progress on those things. If you get that stuff right, eventually you make money. If you focus on money, you don't get the fundamentals right. It's a pretty easy equation for me, and I think there's way too much focus on numbers in every form, where really numbers the output, not the input. So just to agree with Christine's point.
I know we've got time for one more question.
Hutch Hutchinson from Jacobs. I'll just maybe reset the clock a little bit and perhaps go back to the overall vision and strategy side of can industry lead in this area, and perhaps what government can do as well. I mean, from what we've heard today, we've got fantastic national resources. We're positioned in the right spot. We've got all the conditions there, but it seems to me that there's no burning platform, and I think that we've got too many people in the country that suffer from the entitlement mentality, and what we really are looking for is some sort of vision of where we need to go. You know, the examples have been given of Israel and Singapore, and they're two countries which have really had a very clear vision of where they've needed to go and a burning platform. So I just wonder if you could comment on that, and how can we actually change that? Because I think we've heard lots of great ideas about what we can do at the bottom-up level, but what can we do from the top-down level?
Well, I think it probably just calls for a broad comment, but anyone like to?
When you said that, it reminded me of that quote of Thomas Edison of vision is without execution is hallucination, or something like that. And I think you can get too carried away with the vision, and it's, even as Christine spoke about, I've got a vision to get there, but the real practicalities were in the execution of, I've got to do it for risk, I've got to do it for something else. So you can overplay vision. I mean, we don't want to be waiting for the government to give a vision, or even for the vision to come like a light from the sky. It's, I guess the fact that I can, if I remember that quote correctly, it's probably because I downplay the vision and play the execution of a business strategy. In the same way Andrew talks about operational efficiencies, you're focusing on the operational efficiencies, because if you get those right, that's the execution, and that's where the core of the value is. So I think, I'm very nationalistic, so I don't know that I think that we're lacking in anything particularly. We've just got to get the execution right.
Okay.
I think, Gillian, I think we're lacking. I love the Colombo plan. And, as chair of ASEAN, we're the biggest funders and supporters of it. And I'm very pleased to say that we're going to be in all 10 ASEAN countries by 2017. I think education is a big differentiator. But look at the number of our students that go to study in Asia and their students that come to study with us. Actually, I think it would be terrific if we had more encouragement of our young people to go to Asia to do their degrees. I'm a great believer that actually, even in this room, we're probably more alike than now you're looking at me thinking I'm probably too passionate about doing business in Asia. But I'm sure if I sat down with every one of you, within 3 points of difference, we'd know someone in common, or someone went to school or something. So as soon as you mix your people up, they get to know those countries, and they become excited about it, and they bring all those ideas home again. So we need to really encourage our people to go out into the world and study and get to know and bring home those ideas, and allow our Aussie companies to have those skills and resource. Colombo is really important, but it is only for a few people. We need it much more grassroots. And the Asian students are much better at going out to the world to do their secondary education than our own students.
Okay.
There's a very small point there, just remind me of something, which is, it needs to be two-way though. So I think we talk about embracing Asia, but I think to some extent it's let's use Asia to make money, or let's use Asia in a way that we want. But to the extent that the Asian nations also seek to benefit from Australia, we're not going to give anything back. So I think clearly it needs to be a two-way relationship.
Absolutely.
For that to occur.
Okay, well, we've come to the completion of our panel, but I'd like to give the panel members the opportunity just to say a passing thought as we go on to the next session. Particularly, you might want to focus it on innovation. Let's go back to where we started. Innovation. Are we talking too much about it? Is it just a modern fad? Is it something that's innately part of the businesses that you're involved with? How would you characterise innovation? We started off, Christine, trying to define it, but what's your parting thoughts, each of you? Just a couple of seconds.
I think Australia's probably better at it than we all want to believe and see, but something we haven't talked about is about diversity of thought, and that actually creates the agenda for innovation. And it's not just gender diversity, but I really want to encourage you all to go out and employ one of these foreign students and bring that diversity of thought into our own businesses or offices.
Yeah, great.
And I only want to say that innovation to me is inspiration. I mean, if you don't have innovation, I reckon life and working life and life generally is pretty dull. So it's not just that we need it nationally as an economy, but we need it for our daily inspiration and excitement and a lot of it comes from, as Christine said, this diversity of thinking and having platforms that connect universities to business, businesses to businesses, domestically to internationally. All of that is really incredibly stimulating, and I think we'll get the innovation if we think of it and being inspired by it.
Look, I guess I'm repeating myself, but just, for me, innovation is just absolutely vital that it permeates the business. And the reality is, if you're not innovating and moving forward very fast, you're probably being overtaken pretty quickly. And so I think it really is vital. That's an absolute core part of what you do.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you. Terrific panel. And I think we all agree innovation equals prosperity. In a world of disruptive impacts, it's ever more important for all the different things we do in business and more broadly. And you've highlighted, all of you, from your deep experiences, some issues that I'm sure that we're all going to be thinking about. We thank you on behalf of CEDA, all three of you, for being here today and making the journey to contribute, and we thank CEDA and Stephen and all of his team for putting this together. Very interesting and enjoyable panel. Thank you very much. Please thank the panel.